Our readings this morning speak of God at work in the world. Some portions are challenging, but I ask you to try to hear these words as they were intended, as a comforting and encouraging message to people who were struggling. These passages speak of hope in a God who is with us, who is faithful and trustworthy, who will not leave us, a God who is moving all of creation towards God's purposes, towards the fulfillment of God's dream. Paul tells us that the Holy Spirit's presence in us moves us to fervently desire God's dream to be realized. Paul tells us when we suffer because of all we see around us that we know cannot be God's vision for human life, we join all of creation in longing and hoping for redemption and freedom. Paul had a great faith that in all things God would be victorious, and Paul proclaimed God's promise of resurrection, reconciliation, and renewal, that God would bring an end to evil and rescue all of creation from death. Paul says, in short, that God wins, and God will not let us go. God is working things out, and will keep working things out. And the suffering we endure, the pain that we see now, it will seem like nothing compared to what is being borne. Paul reminds us that right now we can't see all that will be redeemed and revealed. He says that hope, by definition, anticipates something unseen. Paul says when we reach out to God, even in the darkest times, God is reaching right back to us. Paul proclaimed that hope to the church, and God knows we need that hope today. Jesus also asks us for trust in God's future in his parable of the weeds and the wheat that we hear this morning. The parable Jesus uses is centered in an agricultural metaphor. So I need to confess to you that I am a terrible gardener. When we moved to Roanoke 5 years ago, we bought a house where the previous owners had clearly been much better at gardening than I am. And the first spring and then summer after our move, everything started blooming and growing. And I knew enough to know that not all of these plants probably were intentionally planted. They probably weren't all ones we wanted. And of course, some of them had to be weeds. That's how weeds work. And lots of weeds, when they just start poking up, don't look much different, at least to me, from the things that were intentionally planted. I was afraid to weed something that was a plant I shouldn't dig up. Don't worry, I got help with that part. Fortunately, our next door neighbor owns a landscaping company. That was very helpful. I know some of you are amazingly talented gardeners, but I tell you this story because when it comes to discerning weeds from wheat in any kind of spiritual sense, we're all pretty ignorant. We're often misguided, and we're usually mistaken. We don't have the spiritual gardening skills to always know the difference between weeds and wheat. Jesus says, don't even try. That's not your job. Let the master gardener do it his way. Only God has the ability and the right to do that. Jesus wants us to recognize how easy it is for us to get it wrong when we think we have the ability and the right to decide who is a weed and who is wheat. The church has had a particularly bad habit of doing this, and not just trying to make those judgments, but getting so focused on them that we lose sight of our primary call to follow Jesus and live lives of compassion and mercy and do our part to make the world better, to bring it a little closer to God's dream. When we get lost in the task of judging or sorting, or when we proclaim the message explicitly or implicitly that we are the wheat and all of you weeds out there better watch out, we smother the very hope we're supposed to be kindling in the world, the hope that Paul was talking about, the hope of redemption and renewal and restoration in God's good future. Jesus teaches us, in other words, to stop trying to judge others and just keep doing what is loving, what is faithful, compassionate, and righteous, trusting that God will take care of the rest. Jesus asks us to keep at the work of recklessly loving and welcoming in his name, full of hope in God's plan for the redemption of the world, trusting that God will sort out weeds from wheat in God's good time. Whatever judgment may come rightly belongs to God and is in God's hands. And here's a not so well hidden secret for you. We're all really more like the field anyway, a mix of weeds and wheat that we aren't always able to sort out very well even for ourselves. As Jesus might say, why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Our prayers for God's dream to come true, for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, must always begin with asking God first to weed our own hearts and lives and gather up and burn away whatever in us is opposed to God's will. There are weeds out there. Some of them are terrible and cause unimaginable damage. And that doesn't, for 1 minute, change the fact that we are called to focus on our lives, our behavior, our hearts, how we follow Jesus, how we do the work he has called us to do. We are here to work on our own weediness and participate in making the world more and more like God's dream for a beloved community. We can leave the weeds, or what we think are weeds, to God. So even in these days, my friends, live with hope. Let joyful, trusting, merciful, gracious, generous, compassionate, and welcoming hope characterize your life. That is the way of the wheat.